Good morning and welcome to Strategic Farm Week Winter 2020. It's brilliant to have you join us. Here we are, ready to share with you the results from across our Strategic Farm network this week. Hopefully you've had a good start to the week already. You might have downloaded some of our reports, the harvest report from the east and the west, had a look at the videos, had a look at what's been going on up in Scotland over the last season. A slightly different delivery to you rather than being in a room over in Warwickshire or in Suffolk in Newmarket this year, but hope that you and your family are well and delighted that we can still share the results with you this season. My name's Teresa Meadows. I'm the Knowledge Exchange Manager for AHDB covering East Anglia for cereals and oilseeds, and I'm going to be facilitating our Catch and Cover Crop seminar this morning. The reason we're calling it a seminar session is that this morning is all about trying to get as much in terms of the questions that we can. I know from our experiences in Newmarket, in our workshops, actually it's the questions and the discussion is where a lot of us learn. And so the idea of this morning is that we've got plenty of time for those questions and discussion after we've heard from Brian, Rob and Kate, who are our speakers who joined us today. So just in terms of a bit of housekeeping, you're all on mute. We can't see you or hear you this morning, but we can definitely stay in touch. And in the panel on the right-hand side of your screen, there's a chat box that you can ask questions for us. Please do feel free to use that and send us any questions in as we go through the session this morning. You can send them at any time. It's just myself and my colleague Christian, who sat behind the scenes, that can see those questions, and then we'll ask them to Rob and to Brian and Kate as we go through. Equally, if you have any problems with the audio or visual, please pop them in there as well, and we'll endeavour to help you. We're scheduled to be here until 10:30 at the latest today, and we will make sure we're wrapped up for then. Equally, this webinar is being recorded, so if you wanted to watch it back, you will be able to on our YouTube channel. You don't need to take notes, we'll share that recording and the slides, and if you wanted to forward it on to anybody, that will be available hopefully tomorrow or on Thursday as well. This seminar session is part of a wider series of sessions going on this week as part of sharing our results that's been happening across our strategic farms and introducing you to the trials and demonstrations happening next year. The links to all of that are available on our website and that you can see at the bottom here. Equally, we're tweeting and there's information going out on Twitter, on Facebook and across our channels, and you can find that by looking at hashtag strategic farm or the hashtag for the week as well. If you find things of interest today and want to share it, then that's always great as well, because it increases the knowledge exchange, which this is what it's all about. If you claim basis and Neroso points, this session has been registered for both of those. If you'd like to claim either of those, for basis, if you put your name, your account number and your postcode into the question box, and similarly for Neroso, we need your name, your Neroso number, your date of birth and your postcode. And if you put them into the box, we'll allocate those for you. If you're watching this back, if you send an email to teresa.meadows@ahdb.org.uk, I'll make sure you're added onto those as well. So the format for today's session, Brian and Rob are going to introduce you to their trials. To start with, Brian is our strategic farm host in the east and Rob's our strategic farm host in the west. And Brian has been running a cover crop trial now for the last few years on the farm, and we're looking back at the results from Harvest 2020. Rob, as he'll introduce, has had a different year this last year, as I know many of you have had, and so taken advantage of that to put a catch crop trial in, and we'll be talking through that. So they'll give you some context and some background as to how that's happened from a farmer point of view. And then Kate, we'd be really pleased to work with Kate and Anne and the ADAS team to do the assessments over the year. And Kate's going to talk us through what's been found in terms of soils, water quality, the yield results, and other wider assessments that have been done as well. And then it's over to you. We've got time for questions and discussion, to share your experiences, to ask your questions and to share that amongst us. So the other thing that there is as part of this session is there's another tab on your chat that says handouts. On there, we've added in the harvest report for the east and for the west. This might be something you'd like to download and could read through while Kate's going through her presentation. It contains all the details that Kate's going to talk about, and it contains the links to the videos and things as well, plus all the other results from across the strategic farms. Similarly, AHDB and partners have funded a large project looking at cover crops and the benefits and implications of those in the rotation, and that project reported earlier this year. I've also attached the report and the summary for that project, just in case you wanted to look back at the wider research. The strategic farms are all about putting research into practice, and so if you wanted to delve into that deeper, it might be worth clicking on those and downloading those as well. So what's today all about? And today's about the focus on catch and cover crops. It's about sharing the results that we found on the strategic farm for maybe you to try those on farm to improve what you're doing already and use the lessons learned from what Brian and Rob and Kate have found out. Or possibly, as with a lot of these things, to raise more questions that we could look at in terms of further research. Catch and cover crops certainly one of those things that are very different for different people, and we can endeavour to answer those questions, and if we can't answer them, we can look at them going forwards. So if there are specific things that you'd like to know and have found out by the end of this session, perhaps you pop them in the question box as well, and then we'll make sure that we've covered them by the end. But as I say, please feel free to put them in. I can see lots of basis and Aroso points coming in, so if you missed the introduction for basis and Aroso, please put your details in the questions box and we'll make sure they're added for you. So without further ado, I'm really pleased to be joined by both Brian and Rob and Kate this morning, and we're just going to give you an introduction as to how these trials and demonstrations came about on each of the areas. So Brian, I'm going to hand over to you in Suffolk first.
Brilliant. Thank you, Teresa. Good morning, everyone. I'm just basically going to go through my experiences with cover crops so far. I'd say we're dabbling in cover crops, and we're sort of persevering because there's going to be a few things which are going to come up, which hopefully the next slide will appear and I can start rattling through it. So yeah, so my experience of cover crops so far is a love-hate relationship. It's very much, I can see all the benefits long term when we start looking at where the potential that the industry is going with more environmental farming and having this green cover. When you're looking at regenerative agriculture and having green soil armor and feeding the soil biota, looking at earthworms, there's so many things there's so many good things that it can do for sort of the environmental side. But then when it actually comes down to the actual crop following them, it's actually for the last few years been adding more risk and more headaches for me. This is through either pests or nutrient absorption that meant that as it's breaking down, the other crops starting to grow have sort of struggled to get out of the ground. But it's a really difficult one because I see the benefit long term, but short term I'm being stung from a financial sort of benefit. There's different things that sort of highlight being an arable farm. Livestock, it does give an option to integrate livestock back onto the farm, so that's one thing that I think is a real key for looking at sort of soil health and a mixed farming system again going forward long term. So there are different things that we don't actually have any sort of livestock, so bringing in third-party grazers onto the farm to graze these cover crops and then move them through. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So yeah, so when you look at cover crops in general, soil management, it's all about the idea of organic matter, replenishing what potentially has been lost, getting your soil and your earthworms and your biota working together. Carbon capture, another big sort of buzzword at the moment, looking towards net zero. Is this something that we can do? Is the dry matter going back into the soil actually building carbon? And having a cover crop put into a field you basically then mean that you don't get out and do any recreational cultivations. Once you've invested into a cover crop, that green cover, it means that you don't find a job of someone's hanging around and think, oh, actually we can just go and do this with a subsoil, or we can do this with a cultivator. It actually makes you much more in line with trying to do less for your soil. And then when we know all the benefits of moving your soil less, moving it shallower, and we've seen sort of a great increase through the strategic farm baselining of earthworm numbers, ground beetles now being audited, as well as predatory spiders and everything else like that. So for soil management, they do have their role and their place, but then when it comes to the actual drilling of the crops, as we found this year, they actually, after a very wet winter, we actually found that it was actually detrimental to the crop, because we had then very wet ground conditions at planting, which I'm sure we're going to discuss later on. So if we can just move on to the next slide, please. Yeah, so then when you start looking at the whole sort of big picture of cover crops, it's the soil, crop health protection. Is it actually helping me, or is it actually sort of penalizing me? Well, we've actually found that we've actually had to apply more pesticides off the back of them. Slugs have been a problem. We've actually found that blackgrass has been delayed because the soil and the sun didn't get to the soil, warm it up. We didn't get a flash of blackgrass because it was sort of all in that microclimate under a big biomass, and we never actually saw it until much later, and that then came into the crop that we were then trying to grow commercially. When we were desiccating it, we've tried different things. We've been rolling them, we've been grazing them, we've tried crimper rollers. We've actually found when we have a really big biomass, we've actually had to apply more glyphosate, because the first initial spray off the glyphosate never got to the small plants at the floor, and so then we had to then follow up. We've also found that when we've been grazing it, if we're grazing things like oil radish or stubble turnips, sometimes they just graze the top off, and then when you apply your glyphosate pre-crop, it then reshoots afterwards because there's not enough green leaf to actually absorb the pesticides that are being applied. So it's again, I can see the worth, but it's actually costing me money long term. Then when we're sort of looking at the sort of role they're putting in, I've moved them away from going in front of spring crops, which are very early drilling. So when you're trying to get your spring barleys in, your spring beans in, they can be a problem, because that's normally when the soil is wetter. So now we've moved them into a much later sown spring crops, where we can drag them all the way through much later in the season. We can travel better on the soil. So in front of spring linseed or mustard, we've been actually using it and getting more success in that scenario than actually pushing them too early. So that might be something that I'm just sort of migrating to, much more utilizing them in a different part of the rotation. So that's what sort of we're looking at from there. So next slide, please. This is one thing that I'm quite passionate about, and I'm sure many people who might follow me on Twitter have seen the field urine tests that I've been doing, where we've actually been sampling drain water coming out of fields. And this was something that started at the start of the strategic farm, and I was really keen to know what was coming out, because this is sort of where the idea of public money for public good goods, when you've got water, is seen as a public good. If you can get better, cleaner water, it's going to have a knock-on effect to all our river systems going forward. So if we can absorb more nutrients through our farming system, or by applying less, or being a bit more smarter with what we're doing, we can sort of deliver something quite good for the wider public. And so sort of looking at the sort of nitrate absorption, when we've been doing the drain sampling through Essex and Suffolk Water, greatly supported by them and Ian Skinner, it's been showing dramatic changes, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later on. But where a cover crop has been put through winter, it's absorbing huge amounts of nutrition that's not been absorbed by that. But then the question is, for the farmer, with my other hat on, trying to grow crops, when is that nutrition absorbed? Is it then released again? And this is what we're trying to sort of delve apart, pick apart with strategic farm trials, looking at, will this nutrition that's been absorbed in those plants, will it be released? Is it going to be released the next year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years down the line, or does it actually ever become available, or does it just get swallowed up into the dark world of the soil health underneath? And when does it actually stop being sort of absorbed? Is there a key time to spray it off? Destruction through either rolling it, does that cause a problem? Does it we then get a flush when we sort of destruct them? So there's lots of questions, and that's what I would say is very much my sort of idea of cover crops is long term, yes, lots of good things. Short term, lots of questions that need to be answered, and that's why we're doing these trials across the country with a strategic farm. So the next slide will sort of highlight another benefit, which when it comes up will be the landscape and nature. Yeah, so it's amazing. We've been involved with sort of environmental farming, looking at our farm landscape, and these green covers are giving huge benefits to our farmed environment. The biodiversity within these is it's streets ahead of anything else. When the whole countryside historically went brown or the stubble started to appear, all the crops got cleared, wildlife was really left sort of bare, and having these green fields suddenly appear. It was amazing when I was sort of driving back around the countryside, sort of post-harvest. All the farms around us, there's lots of plough, there's lots of stubbles being churned up. But when we got back onto our sort of patch, all these green covers, it was amazing what extra sort of insect life. Partridges, the grey partridge, one of my sort of favourite farmland birds, absolutely love it, and we've had some great sort of sightings and experiences with the cover crops and grey partridges, snipe, yellowhammers. There's so much benefit that when we're looking at how to really kickstart our biodiversity across our countryside, then this is something that I think we need more of. It gives a late pollinating nectar source. We've got mustard on flower, we've got some bitter linseed coming onto flower now in our mixes, and it's really giving a value. And I'm sure that with integrated pest management, there's going to be another seminar later this week about integrated pest management, giving them a home, a green sort of area, but then it does sort of bring other elements that you possibly are increasing green bridge. So this is something that we've got to consider. So for pests like aphids, but we've actually found that our beneficials are more prevalent in these areas, and so it's working to get our countryside buzzing again. So I think that's sort of a very fast summing up of what we've done. We've looked at short-term catch crops as well this year, which we'll talk about later on. And it'll be interesting to hear what other people's experiences are, because I think that's going to be another thing that's going to sort of bring an element of green towards our farming sort of business. So that's sort of what I would say is my sort of dabbling with cover crops. And if anyone's got any questions, then put them in the box, and I'm sure Teresa will siphon out the good ones and keep the rude ones away from me.
Well, you've got some sticky ones coming in already, Brian, so I'll ask them in a minute. It's great, thank you for the summary. I think it's a really good overview, and you know, the questions that you started with, the things that we're looking at and the things we've learned over the few years, and some of the bits that Kate's going to then introduce some of the answers from this year that we can discuss later on. I will ask a couple of these questions for you now, some quite interesting ones and some just which will help to paint the picture for Kate. So there's one about why are you using large biomass crops when you have blackgrass, which I know for a lot of people that's a big question. Have you got an answer for that at this stage?
Well, I don't have blackgrass. If you believe that, you'll be joking, but I see it. I don't use it for blackgrass suppression. I use it for absorption of sunlight, because that's what we're basically trying to get as much energy into our soil, trying to build sort of organic matter. When we look at our soil tests that we've done, we find that our soil organic matters could be improved. We're on a sort of a clay dominated soil, and so the more I can get sort of into my soil, more roots growing, that's where I'm using it. So I'm actually directing them towards more sort of soil health, organic matter, than actually using them for weed suppression. But when you do have a patch of blackgrass and it does come up underneath a big biomass, it's sometimes quite frustrating, and you then have to reapply a second dose when that canopy sort of get away. And that's why I looked at grazing, to see if I can graze all the biomass out, get a little bit of income, get some sort of walking manure machines floating around my farm, and then hopefully then we can then just do one application of glyphosate pre-drilling, direct drill straight in behind them.
And similarly to that, David's message to say that in front of spring crops, they found that desiccating 6 to 8 weeks prior to sowing has had the best effect to allow the soils to dry and nutrients to be released, and for that black grass to grow. What kind of length of time did you spray or do you typically spray them off? I know last year was a bit different, you know, and does that differ from the norm in terms of that?
What we've been doing is we've been sort of experimenting in different seasons, trying to read what we've got in front of us. Don't just sort of pigeonhole, we're going to get rid of them in December, because sometimes traveling is going to cause more damage to my soil. So I don't want to get left with ruts, especially when we're trying to sort of leave a nice level top to sort of direct drill into. So a few years we've actually left them late. Last spring we left a few fields late, and that actually helped us. But then in certain scenarios when we're trying to force things too early, then it has sort of burnt our fingers. But I also sprayed some off early season a few years ago, and then we saw a spike of nutrition being pushed out from the drains in the drain sampling. So that's very wary of, if we're looking at it from a water quality point of view, when's the key point to actually desiccate them or get rid of them. So there's still questions to be answered, and I think it'd be a really interesting topic to look into of when that nutrition is actually released after desiccation, but then also looking at it from actually establishment of a following crop. But this year I'm probably going to be sort of earlier, because this year they've really gone really well, so they've got some really big crops. So I reckon I'll have to sort of spray them off early to dry them out.
Yeah. And we've got some fantastic questions here coming in about costs, public goods, and allelopathy, and all sorts of kind of things with wildlife and who should pay. I think what I might do is keep some of those for a bit later, because I think once we've heard Kate's presentation, we'll be able to talk about that in a bit of a richer way. The one that I will ask you is the variety of cover crops that you're using. I just wonder if you want to list off a few species that you've done, Brian, and then we'll move on to Rob.
I've pretty much tried everything. First few years we were just buying off the shelf mixes, the real basic ones, sort of EFA mixes, so vetches, rye, oil radish, that sort of thing. We then sort of started trying to get a bit more clever, multiple species, and then this year we sort of did a bit more bespoke, and we tried to get as many seeds per square meter just to get as much root growing. So we sort of changed our mixes year on year, and then we've had some successes, we've had some less successes. So I would say there's no one mix fits every farm, and I found that my next door neighbours tried similar mixes and they haven't got on as well. And I think it's really what your personal aim is of cover crops. I don't think it's not a silver bullet to sort of everything, and I think you've got to be very wary of what you're trying to deliver. I'm trying to develop a high biomass organic matter going back into my soil, so I want a bulky crop, whereas if someone was saying I want to use it for pest suppression or weed suppression, you'd use a different mix. So I would say it's very much the sort of look of which farm, what you're trying to get out of in your farming rotation, in your farming system. So I'd say trial by error and judgment is probably try it, see it, use it, see what you get afterwards, and then you'll sort of learn from your own experiences.
Absolutely, and that was one of the things that we looked at quite a lot in the Maxi Cover Crop Report. And again, for those that might have missed it, if you click on the handouts button, you can download the summary and the full report for that. And there are actually a couple of articles in Direct Driller and CPM and things about it, and that, like you say, Brian, what you're doing and why you're doing it, and then that balance of species is big. Equally, sharing people's experiences in this kind of format is good. So rest assured, those people that have asked brilliant questions, and we'll come back to them. But thank you, Brian, and we'll just introduce Rob. So Rob has done something a bit different, and Rob is looked at running a catch crop on the farm this year, given the season that was there. So I'll hand over to you, Rob, just to introduce what you've done on the farm this year.
Thank you. Thanks, Teresa. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for that, Brian. Slightly different angle from our point of view, from over in the west here. We We farm in Warwickshire, just outside Leamington Spa. We're on some quite varied ground, and a lot of it can be very, very heavy, very, very wet. 2020, so a bit of background to this. 2020, obviously, pretty diabolical year for most of the country, and over in the west on some of these heavier clays, very, very difficult for us. We had very little winter wheat drilled in October and November. Managed to get a bit more spun on in February in a brief dry period, but we were still left with a lot of ground that was destined for winter wheat. Ended up going into spring barley, and we ended up being in a situation where we had one last field left to drill, a very difficult field on one of the other farms we're involved with, varied in soil type, and we, at the last minute, we took the decision, due to the weather, due to the very, very wet winter, and then flipping around to a hot, dry spell, we actually took the decision not to bother establishing a spring barley in this field, instead to leave it fallow. At that point, most of our trials for the strategic farm last year hadn't even been drilled, so we thought, you know what, let's look at a few options. If you've got a fallow through the year, let's look at a few options on how we get that ground into the best condition before putting it back into an autumn crop. And in this case, it was a winter wheat that we were planning to get back into. So spring barley previously, then gone into a fallow for 11, 12 months with the plan to go back into winter wheat. This is the trial field that you can see on the screen. Very varying soil type. It's on a slight bank. The lighter area you can see on the sort of middle right hand side is up the hill, pretty sort of a medium clay loam, and then as you come down the bank, as you move left across the field, as you look at it there, it gets heavier and heavier, and then the bottom of the field is into some really difficult sort of Evesham series, 65% clay, very wet. A couple of springs bubble up in this field as well, so very, very wet spots. So we decided to look at a couple of options on what we wanted to do. The landowner wanted to leave a chunk of it in a sort of a true natural regen sort of fallow to see what grows, which was mainly blackgrass, charlock, and volunteer weeds, volunteer cereals. And then we looked at two other options. One was a bought-in mix from our AGT, which was a phacelia radish mix, and the other one was what we had available to us on farm. So it was a mixture of home saved spring beans and spring barley seed. And you can see how we split it up, and we'll go into a bit more detail of the trial later on with Kate. So what I was looking for from this trial is to put something into the ground to condition the soil, particularly the heavier soil, so we could get a really good entrance back into winter wheat. We've had areas previously of fallow, either where, well, mainly where we've had say either an oilseed rape fail and areas that have been sprayed off, or we've got areas that are bad for blackgrass. Inevitably, in some years, there's been instances where a wheat crop has had the level of blackgrass in it that we've decided to spray that off and have an area of fallow to try and control the blackgrass. Previously, establishing crops after this, particularly coming out of a sort of a winter wheat and then a fallow into an oilseed rape, crops have seemed to establish quite well, but the ground has slumped slightly over the winter, and then even though the establishment was there, it then slows down, gets and it's really hard work for that crop to get well established and grow away well through the winter. So we've we wanted a root in there to try and lift and condition the soil. If we can move on a slide, please. So this is the sort of effect that we saw and that we wanted to see. This is a heavier part of the field. Natural regeneration on the right. Again, like I say, it was mainly just charlock, blackgrass, and volunteer cereals. And then on the left, it was where we put one of the bean and barley mixes. We had a fair bit of biomass there in certainly the 2 planted sections of the trial, and we'll go into that later. So actually we took the decision to mow the crops off so that we could initiate the breaking down of the crop before we went through to create a seedbed. Now, rightly or wrongly, a lot of people will probably ask, why didn't you just direct drill? But we took the decision that we wanted to create a seedbed. So we did go in to lift the ground slightly, sort of 4 inches to start and create a seedbed. And I think it's really obvious there from that photo that where we had the bean and barley mix, where we had a higher level of rooting from that crop, it helped us work the ground down very, very well. And I think what we're then hoping is to monitor this going forward. If we can move on again, please. Monitor this going forward. You know, this is one pass on some really heavy, difficult ground, you know, and we'd be really, really happy with that. We did a light nip over with a set of discs before this was drilled into a winter wheat crop. So in terms of what we saw in the way the ground broke down, there was a clear sort of anecdotal benefit there. It was very visible on the day, even though establishment was a bit difficult, because when we did plant, it then stopped raining, and it didn't rain for 4 or 5 weeks here, and it got quite hot. So establishment was pretty slow and steady. But once the trials did get going, there was enough root mass there to make a difference to the soil. Can we move on again? Is there another one? That's the same one again. So yeah, so that's sort of where we are. We'll go into it in a bit more detail this time in a little bit. But yeah, essentially what we wanted to do then was monitor the wheat crop and see how that performed and how that rooted in the different trial areas. I think by now we would have seen a clear difference, but we had sort of 3 inches of rain within 2 days of having that field drilled. So actually, I think no matter how good condition your soil is in that sort of volume of rain, you know, it's not the best situation. But hopefully, we'll be able to notice a lot more in the rooting of the winter wheat crop over the next few months.
Yeah, definitely, Rob. I think it's a great way to take advantage of the situation, isn't it? And like you say, kind of lessons learned from it, both in this crop and kind of going forward. So thank you for that introduction. And, you know, I think it's a lot of those practical considerations when you're putting in these crops, isn't it? Varying soil types in the same field, how you use that, how you manage that. You know, just because you put the same catch crop in doesn't mean to say that it's going to have the same effect across the whole field, and it's how we do that. So is there any obvious kind of visual signs in the wheat crop yet where it's established, or is it too early to see that? As a question.
No, like I said, I think there would have been in a normal, if we're ever going to get a normal year again, I think there would have been some quite obvious results early on. But like I say, 3.5 inches of rain within a few days of drilling. The biggest differences we can see in that field is purely down to the heavier and lighter areas of it rather than the treatments itself. I think they will show themselves, well, I'd like to think they show themselves through the certainly through the year, but it was so wet and slow to establish anyway that all plots struggled.
And that's something that AHDB will monitor through the year, won't it? You know, won't they? Plant counts and establishment and shoot and tiller and ears. So
yeah, absolutely.
I think we've got some winter wheat in the ground, Rob. Yeah. I think, yeah, it's a bit of a sigh of relief along with many others. Brilliant. So Kate's now going to talk through some of the results that they've seen from both Brian and Rob's over last harvest. For Brian, thinking back to last autumn and winter for the cover crop, and then for more recently with the catch crop. So yeah, over to you, Kate. Thank you.
Okay, thanks Teresa, and thanks Rob and Brian for running us through the trials and the observations they've seen over the last year. So yeah, I'm going to talk about both trials, so both the catch crop and the cover crop trial, and these are I'll be working on these with my colleagues at AHDB. That's Anne, Sam, Leroy, Mark and Damien. Okay, so next slide, thank you. Okay, so they've got the two trials then, as we've run through. So we've got the summer catch crop at Strategic Farm West, and then the cover crop trial at Strategic Farm East. And as Rob's already explained, the summer catch crop trial came about where it was really difficult to get, or wasn't possible to get, an oilseed rape crop established in autumn 2019. And the purpose of really getting a catch crop in is really to see if we can capture useful amounts of nitrogen. And on this field, so at Rob's, Rob drilled the catch crop in May, and then it was destroyed in July 2020. So this is just sort of slightly different from, we'd say, with the EFA rules that would say get a catch crop in around about 20th of August and then destroyed by the 14th of October, which when we say more typical of growing a catch crop for a shorter period and maybe getting something in after peas or beans and before drilling winter wheat. So that's just that distinction there. And then with the cover crop at Brian's farm, again, the purpose is quite similar. We are growing the cover crop is to capture nitrogen and really to help see if we can reduce sort of nitrate leaching losses. And that was just there over winter to provide some cover over winter. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to recap again, so the objective of the catch crop trial is we're going to look at the impact of the catch crops on soil nitrogen supply, soil structure, and this year we're going to monitor the performance of the winter wheat and measure the wheat yields. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so Rob's shown the soil map for this field, and as you can see, there was a bit of variability in soil texture across the field. So to try and account for this variability, we've set the trial up as a replicated tramline trial design and position the treatments across the field just to cover those differences in soil texture. So sort of where the more of the weedy fallow control focused, that was where the soil was a bit lighter, and the rest of the field it's heavier, and it's more of a clay loam there. So with the treatments that we have is this weedy fallow, and then as Rob explained, we've got the farm standard, so that's barley and beans from saved seed. So the barley is sown at around 145 kilograms per hectare, and beans at 225. And then for the commercial mix, we had a mix which is supplied by RAGT Seeds, and this was designed for improving soil structure and improving nutrient retention. So we had phacelia and oil radish in the mix, and that was sown at 15 kilograms per hectare. And if we go on to the next slide. So this is how the mix was looking. So as Rob explained, it took a while for the covers to get growing, but these photos were taken about 2 months after drilling, so taken in July 2020. We've got some really good cover there, and we've got both beans and barley can clearly be seen in the mix there from the farm saved seed. So next slide. So this is the phacelia radish, again, taken at the same time, and you've got good cover there of both phacelia and or radish. And then on to the next slide. And then the weedy fallow control. So less biomass, but still a fair amount of cover there. And as Rob explained, the weeds that we were getting in included a bit charlock, so that's the yellowing plant you're seeing there, wild radish, and then later on some black grass was seen. Okay, so if we go on to the next slide. So this just summarises the measurements we did to assess what the catch crop performance was. So looking at the percent cover, as you can see, good cover across the board in terms of good ground cover. So the weedy fallow is the lowest at 70%, and the highest percent ground cover was seen with the beans and barley. And really, if we look at the biomass that they were producing, we can see that the phacelia and radish produced around 2.5 tonnes per hectare, and beans slightly more at 2.7 tonnes per hectare. So this then reflected in the total nitrogen uptake. So total nitrogen uptake of the phacelia and radish was around 80 kilograms per hectare, and the beans and barley was a bit higher, around 90 kilograms per hectare. And so there's higher biomass and then uptake from the beans and the barley. It's most likely a reflection that's a bit of an uptake of what residual nitrogen is in the soil, but also as a result of end fixation from the beans. So overall, we can see that the main message here is that there is, from the catch crops, the drilled catch crops, we're seeing a higher biomass and a significantly higher N uptake from those drilled catch crops compared to that weedy fallow. So if we go on to the next slide, and looking at soil nitrogen supply, so this is what was measured shortly after destruction of the soil mineral was measured shortly after destruction of the catch crop in July, and that's the blue bar there, showing soil mineral N down to 90 centimetres. So no real differences between the different ground cover treatments there. If we look at the total soil nitrogen supply, so that's the blue plus the green combined, see that the soil nitrogen supply is ranging from around 90 kilograms per hectare, where we had the weedy fallow, up to 130 kilograms per hectare following the bean and the barley catch crop mix. And we've seen, the stats were showing that the soil nitrogen supply from those catch crops was higher than the weed fallow. It was almost that the beans and barleys was almost significantly higher than the phacelia radish, but it was out by the smallest margin. So really, so these were all the results from this trial to date. So it's very early stages of this trial, and going into harvest 2021, it'll be really interesting to see what the impacts are of these contrasting covers on the crop yields, really. And so a couple of weeks ago we started assessing soil structure, and we've been assessing and measuring NDVI to look at what the impact of the contrasting catch crops are on the winter wheat establishment. But as Rob noted, it's been really wet, so it's hard to pick out the differences between them at this stage, but we'll see how those results develop.
Can I just ask a quick question, Kate?
Yeah, sure.
It might be worth asking it now. Just a quick question about when your covers are measured and the nutrient uptake, for example, your N uptake is measured, is that just above ground cover or above and below ground? Sort of worth asking that now.
Yeah, so for the green bars, so that we can see there, that's just the above ground N content. So of course with the beans, there will be possibly more, it might be a breakdown of nodules into the season, so it might emerge that we pick out more available N on that treatment as we go on. But yeah, that's just above ground biomass there from those ground covers.
Lovely. And I'll just answer, there's another question about why there were such high rates of barley and beans that were used. And the answer, Rob's kind of replied and said they wanted the cover for that one, worried a thinner crop wouldn't do the job. So yeah, just answer those ones as we go through. Thanks, Kate.
Okay. Okay. So we can have the next slide, please. Great. So moving on then, so we'll move on to the cover crop trial at Strategic Farm East, and the overall objective of this one was just to see if we can get a well-established cover crop if has positive impact at reducing nitrate leaching losses, which we were inferring from the drainage concentrations that Brian has been measuring, and look at the impacts on soil structure and spring crop yields. So if we go to the next slide. So we this year in 2020 we had the trial taking place in 2 fields at Brian. So we had Appletree and Blacksmiths, and at each field we were testing a different cover crop establishment method. So on Appletree we were establishing the cover crop following ploughing, and then on Blacksmiths it was a stripped tillage 1 pass system, which cultivated soil down to around 20 centimetres. The trials are set up as a split field design, and this was done because there's a split drainage system in the fields, and it meant that Brian could continue sampling the drainage water over winter and just look at what the impact of the contrasting ground cover had on those losses of nutrients over winter. So the cover crop that Brian drilled was a mixture of rye, buckwheat, phacelia, or radish, sunflowers, and this was drilled at 20 kilograms per hectare. And the cover crops were drilled by the end of August. If we move to the next slide, we can just see how they established. So really what we were seeing that following the drilling, we had better established, there was a bit more greater biomass and more even cover on the 1 pass system. So that's the photo on the left from Blacksmiths compared to what was seen on the ploughing. And these photos were taken in December 2019. But then by February, the cover crops had sort of evened out with each other, and they produced similar amounts of biomass. So we had about 1.4 coming off the ploughed and 1.6 tonnes per hectare coming off the 1 pass system. And overall, that biomass, or that above ground biomass, had taken up around 45 kilograms of N per hectare. Perfect, thank you. So looking at these are the drainage water nitrate concentrations, and obviously, if I dare say, it was a good year for measuring sort of what the impact of cover cropping had on nutrient losses from this site. So this year we had measurements going all the way from November to February, and really we can see clearly the impact that the ground cover is having on nitrate concentrations. So we've got higher losses from where there isn't a cover crop. So the highest nitrate concentrations on the ploughed, followed by the winter stubble. And then the cover crop treatments, where the nitrate concentrations were much lower. And if you look at the cover crop on the 1 pass system, they were even lower still. And it's well below that EC drinking water nitrate limit of 50 milligrams of nitrate per litre. And that's probably reflecting that early on that cover was well established and it was much more even early on in the season compared to the ploughing. So it was having a bigger impact on reducing nitrate losses earlier on. If we go to the next slide. So we measured soil nitrogen supply both in the autumn and then in the spring. And so looking at the soil nitrogen supply, so this includes the soil mineral down to 90 centimetres and again above ground biomass. And we've got an indication that there's a bit of mineralisation occurring over winter. So we've got an additional 25 to 30 kilograms recovered in the crop and the soil in the spring compared to the autumn, which is the blue bars. And really, without that cover crop, that would have potentially been lost as nitrate leaching over winter there. So if we go to the next slide, so if we look at the impacts on yields. So in the spring, we were able to measure the impact of the cover cropping on the spring barley yields, and we used the AHDB's agronomic software to statistically analyse the yield maps, and so we can come up and say whether there's an difference between the two treatment areas within each field. And overall, we saw that there was around about a 2 tonne yield reduction following the cover crops. And it's really as a result of just the difficult conditions that we were having in the autumn and spring last year. So it's really as a result of the combination of sort of ploughing and drilling in the wet soil, but also we had, Brian had quite a bit of pest damage. So on Appletree, Brian found that ploughing, then drilling the cover crop in the autumn caused some surface compaction, which then when it came to drilling the cover crop in the spring, it made it very difficult to drill, and the drill was skating across the surface. There was also a bit of slug damage within this area, within the cover crop area, within the Appletree field. Then on Blacksmiths, slightly different. It was difficult to get the spring cereal crop drilled in this, and this is really as a result of the soil in the cover crop area being a lot wetter. So we've already talked about the window that should be left between drilling, destroying and drilling the cover crop. And unfortunately, in this year, just due to the really wet soil conditions, there was only a 2-week window between destruction and drilling. So that was clearly having an impact at drilling. There was also a lot more slug damage in the cover crop part of this field. And Brian was noting that there were a lot more slugs down in the slots and not on the soil surface. And even when applying pallets, it wasn't having an impact because the slugs weren't coming up to the surface. So again, really challenging conditions for getting cover crops in these wet soil conditions, and it just impacted on the establishment of that spring barley, which resulted in those yield reductions that we're seeing. And if you look at the handouts, you can see the full gross margin calculations for these two field sites. So if we move on to next slide, yeah. So we also wanted to investigate what the impact would be on the biology in the field. So we carried out some earthworm assessments. So this was carried out following the AHDB How to Count Earthworms guide, and we group earthworms according to ecotype. So we've got anesic, endogenic, epigenic groups, and then we also count the juveniles, and then we score the fields according to the AHDB BBRO soil health card, scorecard. So overall, across both the fields, there was a good number of earthworms. So more than 8 worms per pit were being picked up, and these mainly comprised of the juvenile. So that's the dark blue bar there, and also the adult endogenic. So the topsoil earthworms were found. But there was no difference with or without cover crops on earthworm numbers. If we compare the two fields, they have a similar site history. So previously both had the same cultivations, and then this year Appletree was ploughed. And what we're seeing is that where we've retained the minimal cultivation or the strip tillage on the blacksmiths, earthworm numbers were overall greater. There's also some epigenic earthworms present, and this overall probably indicates that it's the ploughing that's having a detrimental impact on overall earthworm numbers, and also on the community structure by the absence of those epigenic worms on the ploughed side. So it's the strip tillage is increasing the variability of the surface trash, and it's reducing disturbance of the earthworm burrows. If we go to the next slide, please. So just as a final note, this year we've been measuring pests and natural enemies across both Strategic Farm East and Strategic Farm West. And Mark Ramsden is going to be presenting a webinar on this later in the week. And it's just something to show that for this year, we were seeing a positive impact of cover crops, really. And we found that the cover crops were having a positive impact on one particular group. So we put pitfall traps out, and then the species, we identify what's present in the pitfall traps and group them according to functional groups. So species that carry out similar functions. So what we found was for functional group 6 beetles, such as one pictured here, which are an important group. They are small but generalist predators. They consume eggs and soft body invertebrates and larvae, and really have a big impact at reducing pest populations. So these were found higher numbers in the cover crops compared to the bare ground. And so it's the habitat of the cover crop which was providing the prey and just for these predators. And going into the spring barley, again, the numbers for this functional group 6 were still high. So it's that cover over autumn and winter was increasing the survival and generally improving the abundance of them through the year. So just a positive thing to finish on, really, for the year. Next slide, please. Okay, so just final slide, and just really to summarise what we've been seeing. So the catch crop demonstration, really, it carried out as a way of considering something to do when we're just impossible to establish a cash crop. So getting a catch crop when conditions prevent establishing a cash crop. And as the initial results we're seeing are showing that we get greater biomass, and we're getting some greater N uptake compared to the fallow. And going forward, it'll be interesting to see what impact this has on crop yields, really, on the winter wheat yields. And already Rob's seen positive impacts on from having those drilled catch crops compared to that fallow. It's improving soil workability compared to just leaving it fallow. For the cover crop demonstration, consistent with what we've seen elsewhere, is where you can get a good cover crop established earlier on. It's having positive impacts at reducing nitrate losses, which was seen with reduced concentrations in those drainage water. It had a positive impact on natural enemies, so that was that group, functional group 6 of beetles in the cover crop, and that was retained and could be seen in the following crop. But just really due to this challenging year that we've had, there was a reduction in spring barley yields following the cover crop, and that's due to this combination of pest damage from slugs, but also the ploughing and drilling in wet soils. And just to say, going forwards, both of these trials will be continuing, and the impacts on soil structure will be monitored, so nitrogen supply and crop yields. And that's it. Thank you.
Absolutely fantastic, Kate. Thank you so much. There's a lot in there, a lot of work that's been done on farm, and yeah, lots to think about. I've got loads and loads of questions coming, which I've attempted working hard while you're doing that to categorise, and we can share and have a good discussion. So Brian and Rob, I don't know if you want to come back as well. And then what we thought we'd do, everybody, you're very engaged because you're sending me lots of questions and kind of things to discuss. I've given Brian and Rob a heads up on some of them, and Kate, and we can talk about it. But we thought what we might do is just ask you guys a couple of questions first before we get going, and kind of see how you got on last year. So Christian, if you'd like to launch the first poll, please. So to answer a poll, you actually have to click on the screen. And so if you can click on the screen and answer this one. So due to the wet soil conditions of last year, were you unable to establish a crop? So we've got just under 200 of you on here at the moment joining us today. So the results are coming in. Quite a clear one. 40% of you have been able to do that. So hopefully it's easier to click on the screen on a computer than it is on a mobile. We'll give the other half of you a bit of a chance. And then Christian, do you want to display the results, please? So 66% of you couldn't put a crop in last year, and I think, yeah, Brian and Rob, I think we can all identify that, couldn't we? A difficult year all round for us. So if you want to just launch poll 2 as well, Christian, that would be brilliant, and then we can ask everybody. So those of you that were unable to establish a crop, what did you do with that land last year? Did you leave it fallow? Did you put a summer crop in, either with some farm safe seed, or did you buy a bespoke mix? Or did you do something else with it? And if you did something else with it, if you'd like to pop that in the chat, then we can share that and have that as a discussion. So good numbers, we'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. And it just gives us an opportunity, Rob, doesn't it, to compare that with what you did and with what Kate's been able to see around the room. So if you want to display the results for that, Christian, please. So 35, quite equal, there you go. 35% left it fallow, 35% bought a bespoke mix. Some of you just used some farm safe seed, and some of you did other things. Ben said they put a spring crop in, and I'm sure there's a few other of you that went for that option as well. So if you want to come back, I might actually, Kate, Brian, Rob, I might do all of the polls and then kind of talk through these questions in order, if that's okay. Yeah. I don't know if you want to do poll number 3, Christian. So do you include cover crops in your rotation as well? For the farmers in the audience, I know a few of you are students, Lucy. Hopefully you're learning and can do that, that's fine. And just to answer your question, Lucy, as well, while we're just waiting for this to come through. So Lucy asked how long the study will last. So our strategic farms are 6 years long, and these trials and demonstrations are within that. So Brian, you've been doing this as your 2nd year now of cover crops, isn't it? And Rob, you know, you're kind of doing different things. So 6 years overall, and then some of the trials are going on over 3 years. Some of them are going on a shorter time. So do you want to display that poll, Christian? So 59% of you are using cover crops already, 19% not. So there's a lot of experience out there, and hopefully some of the things when we talk about this morning are familiar for you. So the 4th poll, Christian, please. So if you use or plan to use cover crops, what are your main reasons? On this one, you can click a few different answers based on what Brian and Rob and Kate have talked about. Is it reducing nutrient losses, controlling soil erosion, improving soil structure, building soil fertility, or managing weeds, soil-borne pests? And we've got a few questions on all of those that you've sent in, so we'll ask those in a minute. So if you'd like to display that now, Christian. It's quite interesting. So there you go, a bit of everything. And I think, like you said, Brian, you're trying to build organic matter. Rob, you've looked at a few different things. So definitely improving soil structure is the main one, building soil fertility, but also reducing nutrient losses and controlling soil erosion, and maybe not quite as much for the weeds and the pests. And we've got a few questions about BYDB and aphids and pests that we'll come to in a minute. And so the last poll then, Christian, and this would be an interesting one for us all to do, look at is if you don't use cover crops, what's your main barrier at the moment? Is that because it doesn't quite fit in the rotation, because of weed pressure, possible increases because of the costs involved, because of that potential impact on the following crop and its yield, or just because you haven't got enough information yet and don't feel that you can fit it in? So we'll just let you all vote for that. And then Brian and Rob and Kate, just to warn you, what I've done is categorise the questions and maybe we'll follow it through the year. So we'll start with kind of drilling dates and seed rates and seed, and then we've got some questions on agronomy. We've got some questions on the nutrient kind of uptake in the next crop, and then kind of some policy questions. So if I can ask you to do quick fire answers, we'll get through as many of these as we can. So if you'd like to display the result of that, Christian, please. So yeah, there you go. So there's some good questions in here about costs, which I'll put to Brian and Rob in a bit. But yeah, the rotation, actually, have we got enough information? And Kate, you know, that's what we're here to try and do, isn't it? And to look at, and potentially that impact on the yield. Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Christian. So thank you so much, Kate and Brian and Rob, for doing that. Are you ready for this? We'll go for as quick as you can to get through these questions. So I think if we start at the top and start with kind of drilling date, Rob Bowman put a question in quite early on. How important is drilling date for crop establishment? Brian, do you want to do that one?
Yeah, well, we've sort of seen straight behind the combine is critical because it's warmer soils, more sunlight, and we're fortunate that we've got labour that we can get and do that. But whereas if you didn't have the chance, and as soon as that crop's cleared, try and get something in straight behind it, and the earlier normally gives better success.
And Kate, we found that in the maxi cover crop as well, haven't we? You know, and Rob, I'm sure, you know, you'd found that as well. The earlier, the better to get that biomass, and that's come back again and again. Brilliant. Brian, the next question for you as well from Andrew Russell. Did the one-pass system establish better, do you think, due to moisture retention? That's quite an interesting one for the cover crops.
Yeah, well, we've moved to a more sort of regenerative, lower soil disturbance farming systems in the recent years, and certainly when we tried using the disc drill, the direct drill, sometimes we didn't get the success because the ground was so hard. Our clay goes rock hard, really. So the strip drill has actually sort of been much better way of establishing them, and that's what we've done for the last few years. Where we ploughed it for the trial, I wouldn't really want to do that, but we were obviously looking at it for overwinter ploughing versus cover crops. But yeah, certainly where we then ploughed it, stirred it all up, put the seed in with a different drill, cost more, lost more moisture, and certainly if you can get your drill right behind the combine, there's always a little bit of moisture behind the combine, mixing in the straw, and then getting a crop away, it's certainly been better for moisture and rolling it straight behind as well. So literally, I've got a chap who gets on the big drill, drills it, and then turns around and rolls everything within sort of 48 hours of drilling wherever possible.
Brilliant, thank you. Anything to add on that, Kate?
No, I think as Brian explained, I mean, the treatments that we had in the two fields, the different establishment, was really just as part of the trial. And in a wet autumn that you had last year, you wouldn't be looking to be ploughing at that time your cover crop. And if you look at the work that, say, Tom Store's done, the surveys he's done, the majority of the cover crops are really established in these reduced tillage approaches rather than, say, ploughing.
And a question, an interesting one from David Miller, is how both of your fields have been kind of cultivated in previous years. Rob, I don't know, you do a mixture of cultivation.
Yeah, so pretty standard sort of non-inversion disc tine combination machines. farm standard is usually around sort of 6 to 8 inches in a sort of insurance policy to try and get water away over the winter. But that would be our farm standard nip over once with that, let it weather off a bit, and then nip across lightly with something else, set of discs or something, just before we drill to create the seedbed.
And Brian, for yours?
Yeah, so we've got a direct disc drill, and we've also got a strip till tine drill. So we're trying to do as little as possible and using the appropriate drill. But I've still got the backup of the plough. The plough is only used when required for sort of blackgrass management. I've got fields now which are sort of getting to 10 years, 12 years, which haven't been ploughed, so sort of try and do less. And then if we need to create a stale seedbed, a very light, shallow disc carrier pass, and then using the low disturbance disc drill into that afterwards. So we're sort of trying to be appropriate to the field that we're seeing with the conditions that we see at the time.
It was quite interesting. I had an opportunity to speak to David Montgomery the other day, who wrote Growing a Revolution, which we're going to write up and share with you as part of the REAP conference. And I did put to him, Brian, the question about your drop in yields on the cover crop areas. I thought, why not? And I don't know, David, whether it's what you're kind of thinking as well, but there was that kind of thing with these systems, whether you go into it wholeheartedly and actually whether you need to be doing less cultivation all the time, or whether we can kind of find a way of making the cover crops work with whatever cultivation system you have. So yeah, interesting discussions. I'm sure we can carry that one on.
Can I just add to that, the actual drop off of yield, when people say that there's a drop off yield of direct drilling and things like that, I've actually found that when you get things right, there hasn't been a drop off of yield. It's normally because I've done something wrong, which has caused that problem. So I didn't get the slug pellets in, I didn't see that. The split field trial was slightly different. If I had a whole field like it, I wouldn't have carried on drilling it, but because it was a split field, it was very hard that half was going well and half was going suboptimal. So I think there's more is you need to learn by your mistakes, and I've been on this journey for sort of 5 or 6 years, and I can count, and I've got a list of them on my office wall, the decisions I've made which have actually cost me quite a lot of sort of yield in the end of it. And that's what you got to learn by, just try these things and do your best. That's what I would say.
I think also it was I think also it was just such a wet spring as well, Brian, and I mean, look at the weather data for you, and it just didn't stop raining in February, and I think you had a window of like 2 days when you could actually get in, it stopped raining, and which in the end meant that it was only possible to leave that 2-week window between the destruction and the drilling. And you know, as we've already discussed, ideally you want to leave longer than that so that the soils can dry out and get the sun and the wind onto that soil, so you've got that good seed bed at the time of drilling. And I guess for you, given that you're on slightly heavier soils, your strategy is to go for later spring crops now, is just to guarantee that you're able to leave that window. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, and that's where with later spring crops like the linseed, the mustards, when they're being drilled much later in the season, that gives me a much better chance to clean up any blackgrass, any germinating blackgrass in the spring. You get that sort of the double bite of the cherry, and then you've got that green cover that when it gets later, that moisture being held in your soil actually probably benefits it. So it doesn't go bake solid. With the plough field that we looked at, when we then got rid of the smaller cover crop, the sun then dried it out, and it literally changed within 3 days. And so you could see that it went from suboptimal to perfect to suboptimal in the space of 3 days. And then we found that the drill was skating around on top because the plough had baked solid. So it's every season has been different, and that's what sort of we've got to be very conscious not to farm for last year, but you've got to be able to read the scenario in front of you. And I'm sure that's what Rob's sort of saying, that you can see the experiences that you see, you've got to remember them and learn them and sort of try and keep a record. And that's where different like WhatsApp, my phone has a photo album of different things that we've seen, and you just go back through the year and go, oh, that's what we saw this is what we did, this worked, this didn't. It's just having that record sort of system is really key.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think neither of us are saying that these systems cannot work and won't work in certain situations. They're going to be very, very different in different situations, different microclimates, different soil types, and what works really well in one area may not work well in another area, but it doesn't mean that something else won't work very well there instead. So it's absolutely not a sort of dead end.
No, absolutely. Absolutely, and it's kind of finding ways to make them work on our soil types and our climates and things, isn't it? And that's what we're all here to do. So there's some questions in here, Brian, about you know, whether you could have waited another 7 days, you know, on heavier ground for your drilling, and I think you've kind of answered that already, and you know, those things. There's a few people in here that have said about the need to mow and cultivate your spring crop before going in. I don't know if you just want to answer that one very quickly, and then I've got a few for Rob coming up.
What do you mean by mowing the cover crop down?
Yeah, and cultivating it before sowing your following crop and grazing, as opposed to simply incorporating it.
Obviously, we've got direct drills, so the idea is low disturbance. So I don't want to go and sort of lose all the moisture out of the top, but it's something that I did consider getting the carrier out and whipping over the top and chopping up the green material that was left. That may have helped, but then it comes down to cost when you start adding another pass, more time, more diesel when you're already trying to be busy. But the idea of trying to do less is more is sort of what we've done, and we've had successes with direct drilling on the back of them as well. So it's so, and that's where it comes back to, for me, is it's short-term risk, and you're trying to make your best crop, your most money. And we've seen that we've had a yield penalty this year. Last year they sort of showed a little positive, and it is short-term risk, and you've got to be right on top of your A game. You've got to be on top of everything. You need to know what conditions are. You need to know across the whole field. We've got headlands and things get sort of packed down quite tight, so then do you do something else? So when you're turning, if it's not right. So I would say that, but then at the back of my head is when you're trying to get spring beans and spring barley, and you want to be going earlier, so then you don't want to have those wet soil conditions. So that's why I'm going actually shallow cultivations, stale seedbed for those early ones, and then, or where we have a small seed like spring barley, spring beans with a big seed might be able to do something different, more of a cereal based mix, and then obviously going later with the small seeds later in the year when the soil's warm. So it's really short-term risk for me.
Yeah, and you must have, Chris, read Chris's mind, because he's just put something very similar up here. So it's great, thank you. Moving on, Rob, there's some questions here about, you know, having beans in the cover crop rotation and taking them to flowering, and whether that'll have an effect on the following crop. There's a question for both of you that I'll do at the same time, about whether you've seen many aphids, whether we need to be considering, I don't know, Kate, if you've got anything to add from the research point of view about kind of green bridge and aphids and BYDV at the moment. So Rob, do you want to tackle that one first with the species mix that's been chosen and the impacts?
Yeah, absolutely. It's always a worry taking a green crop into a new crop. It's always a worry what you're going to harbour in that green crop, whether it be disease or pests. Again, I think it comes down to sort of learning curves, where we're benefiting from them in some ways. Other things could possibly be detrimental, and how best do we manage those going forward. We chose the bean and barley mix for a couple of reasons. One, the most straightforward thing is that was what was available on farm, and we're kind of thinking, if farmers are dabbling into this, rather than going out and buying an expensive mix, use what's available to you. You know, if it's your last half load you can't get rid of, yes, there is, you know, expense associated with that, because it's it's another bucket full of beans you can't sell, but how, you know, it's available and it's easy. I also wanted to use beans just for the rooting. They can root quite deep and quite quickly for us, we knew they weren't going to be in the ground for a very long time. So I think it very much depends on how long your crop is going to be in there for.
Brilliant, thank you. There was a question, Rob, about whether you're intending going forward to do your nitrogen as a flat rate or a variable. Do you want to just answer how you're going to do that?
Yeah, so we usually apply it variably with the help of an Azaria sensor mounted on the tractor, so real-time variable rate nitrogen. Now, depending on how we get that set up, because it is very much, you know, based on the information we input into that system. If we get that set up rightly, there's no reason why we can't take into account how the wheat crop is growing. So if there was any nitrogen available to it, and therefore it's a bit greener, we can always set the machine to apply less nitrogen onto those areas. So it's doable. Yeah.
Brilliant. I think, as Kate, it's always an interesting one, isn't it, when we're trying to design these kind of research protocols, and you know, you guys constantly keep us grounded in what's a farmer facing thing to do and what's a research thing to do, and we have that dynamic. You know, I guess ideally we'd have it all the same, but actually in reality, would you do that? And probably not. So yeah, it's one to kind of think about and take forward as we go.
Yeah, it is. It's a tricky one, really, because you could answer lots of different questions, really. Potentially, keep it a flat rate, so keep everything the same, or do you take account of differences in either above ground biomass or SNS? So one to think about how we structure that.
Brilliant. And we've got some questions along that line as well, Kate. The first one, do AHDB provide guides on how to sample and test nutrient uptake for growers? I know there's quite a bit of information out there, but do you just want to talk through how you'd kind of do it?
Well, I mean, we did it. Obviously, the fields that we're working on the whole field scale, so there's variability across the field, and we set up sampling zones based on we took penetrometer measurements, so within the different soil textures. We identified max, min and medium, and then had our assessment areas around the median areas penetrometer within each of the soil zones, and then went in with quadrats when we took biomass samples, so 1 metre square quadrats, and just cut everything down to ground level. Took 3 of those, dried it, weighed it, weighed it fresh, dried it, weighed it again, so you've got your dry weight, and then send it off for analysis for end content. So I think that's something that if farmers wanted to do, they could, you could do those cut downs and send them off for analysis, really.
And Brian, you've done quite a bit of that, haven't you, on the farm? Easy, hard, leave it to the experts, or is it a farmer thing to do?
Well, I like doing it and seeing what's going on, and certainly it's opened my eyes to a lot of sort of roles of nutrition, how it's absorbed. So and comparing different fields, different farms, we've got a small group of sort of 18 farmers who've been doing it for the last 3 years, sort of cutting biomass of growing crops and comparing nutrition rates, levels in them and dry matter and everything like that. So it's very easy to do, doesn't really cost that much. And you can do it a number of times through the season, and you do build up a picture of what sort of nutrition is being affected by your management, but also by your soil type as well.
I think also another thing that farmers can do is, if they wish, just keeping a track on how the ground cover is changing over winter, say for cover crops, and just make a note of how the different species are growing if you're growing a mix, really. So there's those simple sort of observational things that you can do.
Yeah, and a big green top doesn't mean a big root mass underneath, so you make sure you dig a hole.
Yeah.
Okay. There's a couple of questions here about whether we're measuring soil biology and mycorrhizae and things. That's not something that we've included within this trial, is it, Kate? It is something we've included as some of our baselining work across the wider kind of farms, and it might well be something we can pick up. I don't know if you've looked at mycorrhizae and cover crops anywhere else, Kate?
No, it's not something I've looked at really at all. I think for the biological, that looking at the earthworms was really motivated by this is something that's included in the AHDB soil health card. So it's we've got sort of the clear sort of indices or thresholds established for the earthworms, and it just ties in with something that farmers can do quite easily and cheaply on their own farm. You can and look at the changes over a rotation. So that was the motivation for focusing on earthworms, really.
But again, there are labs that offer that kind of analysis, and it can be done, and it might be something that we look at more going forwards. And picking up on those, Cam and Russell and Richard have all asked kind of similar questions about the removal of P and K and the impact on the subsequent crop, the evidence of when the nitrogen is released, and whether you're going to kind of carry some of these trials on over multiple years, Brian, so you can see whether the benefits accumulate over time. And to answer all of those at once, that is absolutely what we're looking at. And one of the things, Brian, that we noticed kind of early on, that there's a lot of research out there about the cover crop, about the benefit that it has, but there's not much then about A, kind of destroying that and establishing your next crop, and B, what the impact then is going forward. So on all of the trials, the first year on Big Hills and Lawn, we've looked at the uptake of nutrition in the following crop and the following crop yields, and we'll do that for each of these. So Brian's ones that have been presented today, it's actually it's into herbage grass now, Brian, isn't it? But we'll still look at that and kind of keep those going. So the answer to all that is yes. Join us for a future seminar session to get the results, and we'll share those with you as they come forward. I'm going to do one question on costs, and then there's some really interesting questions that I'll pose to you all about the future and future policy. In terms of cost and cost differential between the different seed mixes, Rob, did you notice much of a cost differential between those?
They were pretty much the same for us. I mean, obviously, RAGT supplied the seed off their own back, but obviously, if you're going out and doing it on a larger scale, then you are going to be spending a fair bit of money. They were very very much the same because of the higher rates we used of the home saved mix as well. So yeah, I think even though it's home saved, I said before, even though it's home saved, you have to allocate a certain amount of money to that because it is a bucket full, or it's a load of beans and barley that we didn't sell. I think there are cheaper ways of doing it, absolutely, but it really depends on what you want out of it, and it is going to be an expense that we're probably going to have to take on the an expense that we're going to have to accept to our businesses if we are made to do things like this in the future. So yeah, it's not cheap, it's not free.
No, and that leads me nicely on to the next set of questions. Just before I do that, I will say that both Brian and Rob's, all of these trials have been put through Farm Bench. So there's a full cost of production, net margins through Farm Bench as much as we can. It's not the easiest thing to do this, is it, guys, on a small trial scale, but we have got the information in there. So if you, again, kind of click on the handouts button and download the East and the West reports, they're all in there. That's a really important part of the strategic farm, that we go on that and we look at those costs. So I'm just going to say before I do this, John Batty, you've asked a couple of quite technical questions about ergot and carryover of things. So I will definitely come back to you in that. And what I might do is share all the questions and answers from this session, because there's been some really good questions. I think I've got through most of them. So thank you for bearing with me. So looking forward and future policies, there's a couple of kind of thoughts out there, and I'll pose them to you all before. And you can have a think. So a question about cover crops and kind of the future of glyphosate. There's a question about kind of, you've been working with Essex and Suffolk Water and they have been so supportive. What about water companies kind of offering funding for cover cropping, and at what kind of price would that be enough? Is that something we should do? There was a question about public money for public goods and biodiversity, and perhaps we should be monitoring and quantifying those wildlife benefits that you've seen, Brian, but also stubble can be of a benefit. Should public money for public goods be paying for these kind of benefits? And or, you know, if we're looking at nutrient loss, where does the polluter pays principle come into that? And then if we think about kind of elms going forward and, you know, with their land being left over the winter, should cover cropping be used and incentivised, and what kind of financial value should that be, and what kind of payment structure should that be, Brian and Rob? So quite a lot of questions in there, but they've all got a similar theme. So I think my question to you all is, cover cropping going forwards, should it be incentivised? Like you say, Rob, should it be something that you accept because you want to increase your soil organic matter? Where should it be something that water companies or kind of government support? Where do you see the future of it? And if you have got a cost in mind and a price that you know you need it to be done, you can share that with us as well. So I'll let the guys think. Kate, do you want to go first?
Okay. Yeah, well, I'd start off with in terms of water companies. Yeah, there are some water companies that are paying farmers for having cover crops in. So that's designated in high risk areas, really. So particular fields or particular catchments that are high risk for nitrate leaching. And so that would be something to get in touch with your local water company about if you were eligible for any support for that. I guess so that covers that in that sense. I guess the glyphosate question, whether that's going to get banned or not, that is a really challenging one, really. I'm speaking just feeling from what Brian is saying, even if sort of crimpling or rolling or doing some sort of mechanical destruction or grazing, there seems to be potentially a need to apply some glyphosate just to prevent that regeneration. And I think that's really an area that we need to understand, is how to manage the cover crops in terms of destroying, in case you know glyphosate isn't available for use later in the future. And it's not, and as Brian has indicated, it's not just the method destruction, it's the timing and how that impacts on nutrient losses. So if you're destroying and then it's wet after destruction, you could potentially lose some nutrients. So yeah, the timing and destruction method, really interesting there. In terms of elms and paying for in the future, the policy, you can see naturally, or you'd hope naturally, that it fits in policy going forward. And yeah, the objective is to pay farmers for delivering public goods. So not only it'll be interesting to see how that's costed, really. Is it covering costs and then taking into account these high risk situations where you can lose yields following cover crops? So not just potentially the risk for losing the yields in wet seasons, but cost of seed and operation, but also in terms of reducing or improving water quality or improving biodiversity. So yeah, we're just waiting. I think it's a wait and see how that one works out, really. We're waiting to see if it's included and how that payment structure will work to cover all those different bases in terms of costs.
Thanks, Kate. It's a very comprehensive answer. To my questions, Brian and Rob, do you want to just go for the policy one? And I can chuck carbon in there as well. There's a few people chucking carbon at me. Go on, Rob, you go first.
Geez, that's a massive question. It's a massive question. I think from my point of view, there needs to be money associated with that. We need to have these, if we're going to be made to have these things in our systems, it needs to be flexible and it needs to be funded. Absolutely. We need the problem with some of the systems we've got at the moment, you have to set a 5-year agreement, you have to decide that a year before you start everything, and who knows what the hell the weather's going to do for that 5 years. They need to be flexible. You need to be able to adjust them slightly year on year. In terms of the water boards and things like that, we certainly our local water board, they will offer money for cover crops, buffer strips, things like that. So there are, I mean, it's nowhere near enough in my view, especially when we're on really marginal ground, especially if we're going to be losing yield out of it at the end, as is a lot of the situation. So yeah, it's a huge question. It needs to be flexible, it needs to be funded.
I like it. It's a good take-home message, especially with the season you've just had, Rob. Yeah, it's that farmer kind of side, and policy's got to reflect what happens on the ground, hasn't it, and what you're facing. Brian, last word to you.
I would say, having sat in many meetings with DEFRA, you got the 25-year environment plan, the agricultural bill just gone through the House of Parliament, and I can see that with the environmental sort of push going in the direction of our industry, it's going to be incentivized somehow, but we need more trials like this to showcase the risks to DEFRA, because they think it could be potentially a silver bullet. When you think about drilling, cost of drilling 50 quid, seed costs 50 quid, rolling it, then a yield penalty. This is where the income foregone whole debate comes in. I reckon that we would need to be looking at, if someone said, yeah, to put a cover crop in over winter for these dates, for water quality, for biodiversity, for all the long-term gain that we're getting, but the short-term risk to the actual farmer, I would say you need to be looking at a 450 pounds per hectare cost would make it very attractive to a lot more growers. And this is where the research that we're sort of trying to deliver here with the Strategic Farm Network showcases. The polluter pays is another risk. We know that from the research we just heard that nitrates are completely removed to sort of a very minimal amount. And when you see that the cost of nitrate removal is in the sort of millions, tens to millions, hundreds of millions to the UK taxpayer, this is a really big, easy sort of win for public money, for public good. So I think that's going to be something that we've got to really understand and learn and embrace these, because they do give really good long-term environmental benefit. On the glyphosate banning, I think it'll be a very brave government to ban it, because of everything you're looking at with net zero, with carbon dioxide release or soil organic matter and net zero. So I think it's going to be a real interesting one to see how policy sort of based on it. A debate between cover crops and overwinter stubble. I can see from all the work we've done, we've got overwinter stubble on our farm, and there's not half the number of birds and wildlife insects. Everything is in the cover crop, so I can see that this is a real tick for us going forward, and that's why we need to sort of learn it, embrace it, do more trials, need more people to talk about it, talk about their experiences, and this forum with the Strategic Farm and the Monitored Farm Network is a great way to do it. So thank you very much, AHDB, for doing it.
Thank you, Brian. Great way to finish. No, I think it's just the value of doing it, and I think Kate kind of it brings it together, doesn't it? Often we look at things from one side, and I think the pure benefit of doing this with you both, and thank you so much to you and the team for hosting it, is that we can have these conversations and these discussions and make sure the practical farmer aspect is there. You know, there's so much that you're balancing, trying to do these crops, trying to benefit water quality and the environment, boost your organic matter, make a profit and fit in with policy, and you know, it's no easy task. So thank you for joining us today and for talking it through. I think it's been a really valuable discussion, and thank you everybody for your comments and questions as we've gone through. I hope you feel like I've done them justice. I don't think there's many left, so we'll follow up on those. So just to kind of round off this morning then, just a few more information. Christian, if you can move on the slides a couple, that would be brilliant. So as I've said before, there are the handouts. They are still on the webinar session. If you're quick, you can click on those links. If you're not that speedy, on the Strategic Farm Week Winter 2020, if you just Google Strategic Farm Week Winter 2020, it will take you to our main page that's got all of the sites, and then the results page, there's a link at the top. If you press the here on the click here, it will take you through. It's got all of the highlights of the trials. It's got all of the links to the handouts, and we've also done videos from each of them. We're very conscious this year that we needed to have various different platforms to share the results. So there's one about the cover crop demonstration with Brian and Kate, and there's also one about the catch crop trial with Rob and Anne from ADAS as well. So you can go back and have a look at that. In terms of wider resources, we've also got the Maxi Cover Crop project and report, which I've mentioned a few times now. It is big, but I tell you what, it's a really interesting read, and it answers many of the questions that we've got today, and or poses a lot of questions, doesn't it, Kate, of what we don't know. There is the big report, there is the summary, and there are some great articles as well. So there's one in the CPM magazine, there's one in Direct Driller that Harry Henderson wrote to digest it. So I would encourage you to go and have a look at that. Rob and Brian are here to put research into practice and to do it, and that's the kind of the research that sits behind a lot of this. All of the information on that and the cover crop information is on our website, and there are also farmer experiences from some people that are on this call joining us today around the country in terms of cover crops, and as we've heard today, it's sharing that experience that's important. If you have got questions on cover crops, my colleagues Amanda Bennett or Emily Pope or many others in AHDB have a lot of experience, as well as Kate and the ADAS team that are there as well. And any of us are happy to talk through kind of questions or point you in the right direction of a researcher or another farmer that's doing it. We have got a cover crops publication that's there that is useful to look at, and that's going to be updated on our website with a lot more information next year. So just to say, this is our first webinar session as part of Strategic Farm Week. There's a lot more going on. You can take part in other webinars and watch the videos. We've got a podcast special that Brian's hosted on Friday with a much further look forward to next year that's coming on. There's a harvest report, there's other resources, and we're even going to do a quiz that's launching on Friday just to kind of give us a bit of a lift at the end of the week, a tasty hamper that's involved to either get you through November or have an early Christmas present. So watch out for that. We'll share that on social media and with our emails towards the end of the week. So if you wanted to log on and register, the next slide, Christian, please, you can do all of that either on our events website through the main Strategic Farm page. And we've got the weed management seminar with Richard and Sarah Cook from ADAS and our Danish representative later this afternoon. We're going to have a managed lower input session part 2 on tomorrow night. Bring a beer, have a chat, get involved. It's going to be much more relaxed and talking through how we can look at developing this across a farm scale going forwards, that Chris Leslie is hosting. As Kate said earlier, I'm going to be back on Thursday morning with Mark Ramsden for a really fascinating session about how we can start thinking about the pests on farm. And then Emily Pope is hosting an Ask the Researcher session on Friday morning that we're going to do via Teams as a bit different. So you'll be able to kind of chat and talk to our researchers from NIAB, SIUC and ADAS about what's going on next year. There's also a lot of going on wider, Monitor Farm Mondays, Agronomy Week happening in a couple of weeks, and other regional technical events. So if you want any more information about any of that and you can't find it, please just give me a shout, but hopefully that's there. So next slide, Christian, please. The final thing just before I go into my thank yous is to say that we are actually launching a new strategic farm. So we've got Brian in the east, Rob in the west, David Aglin is our Scottish strategic farmer, and then there is an opportunity to have a new strategic farmer that we're launching as of Monday. So if you're in the north of the country or in the south of the country, we're on the lookout for a new strategic farmer, and we'll share those details as we go through the week. We'd be really pleased to have you involved. There's a lot of questions, as we've just said, that'd be good to answer going forwards. So just a reminder, this session has been recorded and we'll pop it up on YouTube towards the end of the week, so you can watch back or listen again. There will be a survey that you'll get as you leave, and if you can fill that in, that is really useful. A lot of what we've done this autumn is following on from kind of feedback that you gave us in the summer. If you have any other questions that you want me to follow up on, please let me know. My contact details are there. Equally, if you missed putting in your basis and the ROSO at the beginning, please send me your details and we'll make sure we add you. Stay in touch, keep an eye on the website, get involved, and a massive thank you to Brian and to Rob and to Kate. Fascinating morning. We've got lots of lovely questions, and thank you coming in. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you soon.